I'm going to talk to you about television and its effects on aggression among children and adults. The effects have been studied for many decades. Television was first invented in 1927, and in the 50s and 60s, psychologists started to research this topic extensively. In 1992, the APA came out with some guidelines for parents to help them regulate their children's viewing time. So some of these topics are maintaining an activities time chart that includes the children's TV viewing, playing with friends, and homework, and then to discuss and eliminate some of the activities that children like to do. I think this is a very helpful tool for some parents because it helps them keep an overview of their children's activities, where sometimes parents can get so wrapped up in their own activities and everything that needs to be done that children are kind of left to fend for themselves and are kind of on their own to entertain themselves. So this might be an eye-opener for some parents. I think that's a good point. They also suggest to establish a weekly viewing limit and then have the children determine ahead of time what they would like to watch during the week. I think this is a great idea because binge watching kind of develops as you're already doing it. It's not something you plan to do, and sometimes you can just get sucked into watching a show for hours on end. And this would apply even more for children who don't necessarily have the restraint not to engage in that binge watching behavior. Also, they suggest to rule out TV at certain times. This is really important in my opinion. I have a 7-year-old son who, if I left it up to him, would watch his little iPad while we're having dinner, and I don't agree with that. So that's something that I've restricted for my son, and he's okay with that. When we have dinner together, or when we're having a conversation, or when we're out and about, for example, at a store, in the park, or anywhere else, I don't let him watch his little tablet or anything else like that, and I try to make him focus on everything around him rather than a little screen, which can be very distracting. Also, they encourage the entire family to have a program choice before turning the TV on. This encourages some communication among family members, so it is a good tool wherever it's applicable. For me, it's just my son and I, so we don't necessarily enjoy the same shows. However, I think this is where it comes into play for a parent to make smart suggestions, so to find something that's appropriate for the child to watch and also gives a positive influence to their little minds. So, for example, choosing a less violent program rather than something with more aggressive potential, such as Power Rangers or anything like that. Also, they're saying to remember that you provide a model. If you watch lots of TV, chances are your child will too. This is something that I absolutely live by. I myself don't watch a lot of television. I don't have cable television because I just don't think it's necessary to spend a lot of hours just watching soap operas and stuff like that. I honestly also don't have time for it, seeing how I have a full-time job and I go to school full-time. So ever since my son was born, I've been trying to be a counterbalance to his father, who really enjoys his television. And the first 2 years of his life, he didn't get any television exposure whatsoever. I made sure of that. And I continue to try to expose him to as little television as possible so he can also enjoy what else is out there. They suggest that you watch at least one episode of the programs that your children watch to know the frequency and degree of violence. This is a good point because children, I've noticed, will sometimes just get on YouTube and find something that's exciting. Maybe it has cool colors and great images in the initial picture that you see on the YouTube search list, and they just click on it and it goes wherever, and sometimes it's some really off-the-wall stuff. One time I caught my son watching something in Russian, which he didn't even realize that it was a different language. He just asked me, "Mommy, what's this?" So I think it's absolutely vital to pay attention to what your children are consuming on the screen, because it will definitely shape their overall view on social concepts and things like aggressive behavior. With an average of 4 hours a day that children are watching in the United States, this can be a huge contributor in the positive or negative direction. So it's really something we have to pay attention to. When violence is viewed together, we should discuss why it occurs and how painful it is, and then discuss how it can be resolved without aggression, explain how violence on programs is faked, and encourage children to watch programs with characters that cooperate and care for each other. This is something that I've always worked on with my son. Sometimes it seems like they don't realize how terrible the violence is that they are being exposed to, even in supposedly child-friendly videos. So sometimes even on seemingly harmless video games or movies such as Minecraft, you might see something that's really violent, for example, killing a monster. And to them, it's not a big deal because they don't understand what it means to take somebody's life away. I mean, how could they? They're only children, and they've probably never experienced it themselves. So I just try to remind him that life matters, that you shouldn't be casual about it. And especially when it comes to humans, when it comes to human life, that every person has dignity. And while it might seem silly when it's applied to a funny video game, I still think it's important to remind children of the circumstances that they're watching and the bigger picture. And this is something that can be developed over time. I don't expect my son to fully grasp that concept at 7 years of age. I also read that the disinhibition is also dependent on how realistic the display of violence is. So I think this is an important factor. Sometimes children can get really scared, and this might even happen subconsciously. For example, when they're watching some really violent content, it might later come back to haunt them as nightmares, or just as an overall feeling of anxiety, which is something I've also seen in my son's behavior. He was complaining about nightmares for some time, and then we realized that some of the programs that he was watching on YouTube were just not child appropriate, and once we cut those out, he didn't have nightmares anymore. So this is really something where parents have to pay attention, because otherwise it can go south really quickly. So I think overall there have been probably about 50 years, if not more, of research on this topic, and I think there's a lot of very convincing evidence that exposing children to violence and also exposing adults to violence on television can have some very severe effects. And I think it's something we have to be mindful about, because it can just become very casual, and very concerning things like torture or rape or, burning people alive can suddenly be a part of our day-to-day life when we see it on television or in video games. So I think it would be helpful to take a step back and realize what we're flooding our brains with. And also, I thought it was really interesting that some other factors, like poor diet can actually have an influence on our aggressive potential, which was studied by Gesh. Prisoners with better nutrition had fewer violent incidents. So this is another reason for parents to really read up about this topic and understand just how, what a big responsibility we have to raise our children the right way in a world where they're really exposed to all kinds of different influences, whether it be through YouTube or Facebook once they're a little bit older, Twitter. I mean, everything is just pouring down on them, and it's a parent's responsibility to kind of step in and make sure that our children aren't completely, overly aroused by these types of things, because that can just cause a lot of damage in the long run.